The cracks in the foundation. The alarm clock's red digits glowed 4:45 a.m. in the tiny apartment, but 16-year-old Brandon was already awake, lying still on the worn-out mattress he shared with his younger brother Caleb. Their one-bedroom apartment was barely enough for the two of them. The chipped paint on the walls bore the signs of neglect, and the steady drip from the leaky faucet in the kitchen played a lonely rhythm in the background. Brandon stared at the ceiling, thinking about the day ahead. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. There wasn't much in the cabinet. A loaf of bread that had seen better days, a jar of peanut butter, and a few cans of soup from the food pantry down the street. They had gotten by on less. Caleb stirred beside him, his small body curling under the thin blanket. The boy was only 8 but carried the weight of someone much older. Brandon brushed a hand through Caleb's messy blonde hair and whispered, "Get a little more sleep, buddy. I'll wake you up soon." The early morning chill nipped at Brandon as he swung his legs off the mattress, his bare feet meeting the cold, uneven floor. He winced, not from the cold, but from the burden that weighed on him, a pile of unpaid bills on the rickety kitchen table. Rent was due in 3 days, and they were already 2 months behind. He had stretched every penny, every dollar, as far as he could, but it was never enough. No one wanted to hire a teenager still in high school, and the odd jobs he managed to find barely kept the lights on. Caleb needed new shoes for school, medicine for his persistent cough, and maybe, just maybe, a small birthday cake when he turned 9 next week. Brandon glanced at the calendar pinned crookedly to the wall. It hung there like a grim reminder of everything he couldn't give Caleb. His parents' handwriting from last year still marked the dates when rent and bills were due, relics of a time when the burden hadn't been his to bear. Their parent had died in a car accident 11 months ago, the result of a drunk driver speeding through a red light. Since then, Brandon had done everything he could to keep them together. Foster care wasn't an option. He couldn't bear the thought of being separated from Caleb. The social worker had already visited twice, warning him that their situation was unstable. One more visit, and he feared Caleb would be taken away. Brandon shoved those thoughts aside as he opened the nearly empty cabinet. He pulled out the bread and peanut butter and made Caleb a sandwich. No crusts, Caleb always said, just like their mom used to do. Brandon cut the sandwich carefully, setting it on a napkin by the table. The muffled sound of laughter drifted through the walls from the apartment next door. A family was getting ready for the day. It was a sound Brandon had grown used to hearing, but one that now felt like a stranger, too cheerful, too distant from his reality. "Brandon." Caleb's sleepy voice broke through the quiet. The boy sat up, rubbing his eyes. His thin frame was almost swallowed by the oversized sweater he wore. It had belonged to their dad. "Morning, little man," Brandon said, forcing a smile. "Got your favorite breakfast ready." Caleb grinned as he slid into the chair at their makeshift table. "Peanut butter sandwiches are the best." Brandon sat across from him, sipping a glass of tap water. It wasn't coffee, but he pretended it was. It gave him the illusion of control, of adulthood. Caleb didn't need to know that Brandon had skipped dinner the night before to make sure there was enough for him. "What's on your schedule today?" Caleb asked between bites. "Just a few errands," Brandon replied vaguely. "Same old stuff." The truth was, Brandon had no plan for the day. He had knocked on every door in the neighborhood offering to rake leaves, shovel snow, or run errands. The few regulars who had hired him weren't in need of help this week. Still, he couldn't let Caleb see his uncertainty. He had to keep the illusion alive, that everything was under control, that their little world wasn't teetering on the edge of collapse. Brandon walked Caleb to the bus stop, his hand resting lightly on his brother's shoulder. The morning air bit through his thin hoodie, but Caleb's laughter as they passed by a group of squirrels, chasing each other, made the cold a little more bearable. "Don't forget your math test," Brandon reminded Caleb as the school bus pulled up. "Don't worry, I'm ready." Caleb grinned, his face lighting up with a confidence that Brandon envied. As the bus disappeared around the corner, Brandon turned back toward the apartment. He had barely walked half a block when he noticed a group of workers at the construction site across the street. They moved briskly, carrying bricks, loading cement, and shouting instructions to one another. The site buzzed with energy, its skeletal framework standing tall against the gray morning sky. Brandon paused, watching them. They were all older than him, wearing hard hats and safety vests. He envied their purpose, their ability to earn a paycheck, their place in the world. His fingers itched to do something, anything, that would make him feel useful. "Hey, kid," a gruff voice called out, snapping Brandon out of his thoughts. One of the workers, a man with gray hair and a salt and pepper beard, was standing near the gate, struggling to carry a heavy stack of bricks. "What are you looking at? You lost?" "No, sir," Brandon replied, straightening his shoulders. "Do you need help?" The man raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, help?" "Carrying those bricks." "I can do it." The man hesitated, studying Brandon's skinny frame. "This ain't some playground job, kid. These bricks are heavy." "I'm stronger than I look," Brandon said, stepping closer. His voice carried an edge of desperation that he couldn't quite hide. "Please, let me help." The man sighed, then motioned toward the stack of bricks. "All right, just don't hurt yourself." Brandon got to work, lifting the bricks one by one, and stacking them on a nearby cart. Each brick weighed more than he expected, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. His hand stung as the rough edges scraped his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. After an hour, the man called out, "That's enough, kid. You're gonna wear yourself out." Brandon wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Thanks for letting me help." The man chuckled. "You're a strange one. Most kids your age wouldn't last 10 minutes out here." Brandon shrugged, trying to play it cool. "I'm used to hard work." The man's eyes softened. "You're not just helping for the fun of it, are you?" Brandon hesitated, then shook his head. "I need the practice," he lied. "Might want to do this kind of work someday." "Well," the man said, pulling a bottle of water from his lunch cooler and handing it to Brandon. "You've got guts. Come back tomorrow if you're serious about working. Might find something for you to do." Brandon's heart leaped. "Really?" "Yeah, but don't expect a paycheck," the man warned. "This is just you helping out." "Thank you," Brandon said, gripping the water bottle like it was gold. As he walked back to the apartment, Brandon's arms ached, and his hands were raw, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to hope. The job wasn't paid, not yet, but it was a start. Maybe it would lead to something more. Back in the apartment, Caleb greeted him with a bright smile. "How was your day?" "Good," Brandon replied, ruffling his brother's hair. "Real good." Through the window, the construction site loomed in the distance, a place of opportunity and challenge. Brandon didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was ready to face it, one brick at a time. The next morning arrived before Brandon was ready, the gray light of dawn seeping through the thin curtains of the apartment. His arms throbbed with a dull ache from the previous day, and his hands were raw, the faint sting of new blisters forcing him to wince as he buttoned his shirt. But the ache didn't matter. He was going back to the construction site, and the thought of doing something meaningful kept him moving. He poured the last bit of milk into a cup for Caleb's cereal, mentally promising himself he'd buy more soon. Caleb sat at the table, his energy noticeably lower than usual. His face was pale, and his movements were sluggish as he rubbed his eyes. "You okay, buddy?" Brandon asked, crouching beside him. Caleb nodded but didn't meet his brother's eyes. "I'm just tired. I think I caught a cold." Brandon's chest tightened. Caleb's cough had started a few days ago, and while it wasn't severe, it had worsened overnight. They had no medicine left, and a trip to the pharmacy wasn't an option, not with the few dollars they had left. For now, all Brandon could do was make sure Caleb stayed warm and got to school on time. "You rest on the bus, okay?" Brandon said, trying to keep his tone light. You've got that big math test today, right? Show them what you've got. Caleb managed a small smile, his pale lips curling at the edges. I'll do my best. After walking Caleb to the bus stop and watching it disappear around the corner, Brandon turned toward the construction site. The workers were already bustling around, carrying tools and materials to and from various parts of the project. The skeleton of the building stretched higher against the sky, an intimidating yet inspiring sight. The man from yesterday, whose name Brandon now knew was Rick, stood by the stack of bricks he'd helped with. He waved Brandon over. "Didn't think you'd come back," Rick said, his tone somewhere between impressed and curious. "I said I would," Brandon replied, straightening his shoulders. "What do you need me to do?" Rick scratched his beard, then motioned toward a pile of lumber stacked haphazardly near the edge of the site. "That over there. It's got to be moved to the southeast corner. Think you can handle it?" "Yes, sir," Brandon said without hesitation. He grabbed a pair of work gloves lying nearby and slid them on, the rough material already worn thin in places. Rick chuckled. "Good answer, but don't kill yourself. Take it slow. You've got all day." The lumber was heavier than Brandon had expected, the weight testing his already sore muscles. He worked methodically, carrying one plank at a time to the designated spot. Sweat trickled down his back despite the chill in the air, and his breath came in short, sharp bursts. With each trip, his mind churned, calculating how many boards he could move before his body gave out. Other workers glanced at him as they passed by, some with amusement, others with what looked like respect. Rick kept a close eye on him, occasionally shouting pointers. "Keep your back straight. Use your legs, not your arms." By mid-morning, Brandon had moved half the pile. He paused to catch his breath, wiping his forehead with the back of his glove. Rick approached, handing him a bottle of water. "You're doing good, kid. Most people wouldn't stick it out like this." "Thanks," Brandon said, taking a sip. "I'm just trying to help." Rick leaned against the stack of wood, his eyes narrowing as he studied Brandon. "You don't strike me as a kid who's just trying to stay busy. What's your story?" Brandon hesitated. He didn't like talking about his situation. It made him feel small, vulnerable. But something about Rick's tone wasn't judgmental. It was curious, even kind. "It's just me and my little brother," Brandon said finally. "Our parents died last year. I'm trying to keep things together, but it's not easy." Rick's expression softened. He nodded slowly, as if processing the weight of Brandon's words. "How old are you?" 16. 16, Rick repeated, shaking his head. "And you're carrying all this on your own?" Brandon shrugged. "What else can I do?" For a moment, Rick didn't respond. Then he clapped a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "You've got guts, kid. And heart. That's more than a lot of grown men I know. Keep working hard, and good things will come." The words warmed Brandon in a way he hadn't felt in months, maybe even years. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Rick straightened, his demeanor shifting back to business. "All right, back to work. The foreman doesn't pay me to stand around looking pretty." Brandon smiled faintly, the ache in his muscles momentarily forgotten as he picked up another plank of wood. By the time the sun hung high in the sky, Brandon had moved the entire pile of lumber. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, and his legs wobbled slightly as he stood. But he had done it, every last board. Rick approached, holding a sandwich in one hand and a can of soda in the other. "Lunch break. Take it." "I didn't bring." Brandon started, but Rick cut him off, thrusting the sandwich and soda into his hands. "Don't argue with me. You've earned it." Brandon sat on a nearby stack of bricks, unwrapping the sandwich carefully. It was ham and cheese, with lettuce and mustard. Nothing fancy, but it tasted like a feast. He hadn't had a real lunch in weeks, and the food filled him with a strength he hadn't realized he was missing. As he ate, Rick sat beside him, lighting a cigarette and blowing smoke into the crisp air. "You know, Rick said after a few minutes of silence. Construction's not a bad gig. Hard work, but honest. You ever think about doing it full-time? I don't know, Brandon admitted. I'm just trying to get through the next few days. Rick nodded. Fair enough. But if you keep working like this, I bet you could make a real go of it. This world rewards people who show up and don't quit. Brandon didn't respond, but Rick's words stayed with him. Maybe this could be more than just a way to pass the time. Maybe it could be the start of something bigger. When Brandon got home that evening, Caleb was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. His cough sounded worse, and his face was flushed with fever. Brandon's stomach twisted with guilt. He had been so focused on the construction site that he hadn't noticed how quickly Caleb's condition was deteriorating. You're burning up, Brandon said, placing a hand on Caleb's forehead. I'm getting you medicine. Right now. But we don't have. Caleb started, but Brandon cut him off. I'll figure it out. Stay here. Rest. As Brandon walked to the corner store, his mind raced. He had no money left, and the thought of asking for charity made his chest tighten. But Caleb needed help, and pride wasn't worth more than his brother's health. When he reached the store, the owner, Mr. Patel, greeted him with a kind smile. Evening, Brandon. Everything okay? Brandon hesitated, then blurted out, I need medicine for my brother. He's really sick. Mr. Patel frowned, his concern evident. Do you have money? No, Brandon admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I'll work it off. I'll do anything. Mr. Patel studied him for a long moment before nodding. Take what you need. Pay me back when you can. Thank you, Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion. He grabbed a bottle of cough syrup and a small box of fever reducers before heading back home. Caleb was asleep when he returned, his small body curled up under the blanket. Brandon sat beside him, smoothing his hair as he whispered, We'll get through this. I promise. The next morning, as Brandon prepared to return to the construction site, he looked at Caleb sleeping peacefully, his fever finally breaking. A sense of determination filled him. He wasn't just building for today, he was building a future for both of them. The seeds of change. Brandon arrived at the construction site early the next morning, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The ache in his muscles had only worsened overnight, but he ignored it, clutching his brother's improving health as motivation. Caleb's fever had finally broken, and for the first time in days, Brandon felt like he was winning small battles in a war that still seemed insurmountable. Rick was already at the site, leaning against a stack of cinder blocks and sipping coffee from a thermos. He raised an eyebrow as Brandon approached. Didn't scare you off, huh? Not a chance, Brandon replied, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. Rick grunted in approval and motioned for Brandon to follow him. All right, kid. Today's a bit different. We got a shipment of rebar coming in, and it's got to be sorted and stacked. Think you can handle that? Brandon nodded, though he had no idea what rebar was. I'll figure it out. Rick smirked. That's the spirit. Follow my lead, and don't mess up your back. They worked side by side as the delivery truck arrived, its bed loaded with long, thin rods of steel. Brandon quickly learned that rebar, short for reinforcing bar, was used to strengthen concrete. The rods were heavy and awkward to carry, but Brandon mirrored Rick's technique, gripping them firmly and keeping his back straight. The morning passed in a blur of labor, the rhythm of stacking rebar and the metallic clink of steel filling the air. Other workers occasionally stopped to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Kids got hustle, one of them muttered, loud enough for Brandon to hear. Rick overheard too and chuckled. Hustle's one word for it. Desperation's another. Brandon stiffened, heat creeping up his neck, but Rick clapped a hand on his shoulder before he could respond. Don't take it the wrong way. Desperation's not a bad thing. It means you care. Just don't let it burn you out. By noon, the rebar was neatly stacked, and Brandon's arms felt like lead. He sank onto a nearby crate, grateful for the break. Rick handed him a sandwich, ham, and Swiss this time, and a bottle of water. "Eat," Rick said. "You've earned it." As Brandon unwrapped the sandwich, Rick lit a cigarette, exhaling a plume of smoke that hung in the cool air. "You're a quick learner," Rick said after a few moments of silence. "Not many kids your age would last a day out here, let alone come back for more." "I don't have a choice," Brandon admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's just me and my brother. I've got to figure this out." Rick nodded, his expression unreadable. "You ever think about making this a real thing? Construction, I mean. It's hard work, but it pays decent, and you'd always have a job." Brandon hesitated. "I don't know. I'm just trying to survive right now." "Well," Rick said, leaning back, survival's step one. Step two is figuring out how to get ahead. The words stuck with Brandon as they finished their break and returned to work. The rest of the day was spent moving more materials, cleaning up debris, and shadowing Rick as he explained the basics of construction. Brandon absorbed everything, his focus sharp. He didn't just want to help anymore. He wanted to understand, to belong. That evening, Brandon returned home to find Caleb sitting at the table, coloring in one of the books their mother had bought him years ago. The sight warmed Brandon's heart. Caleb's energy had returned, and his cheeks were no longer flushed with fever. "Hey, bud," Brandon said, dropping his bag by the door. "How was school?" Caleb looked up, grinning. "I got an A on my math test." "That's awesome." Brandon ruffled his brother's hair, pride swelling in his chest. "See, told you all that practice would pay off." He glanced at the table, where a small envelope sat next to Caleb's coloring book. His heart sank as he recognized the bold red lettering on the front. "Final notice." It was from the landlord. Caleb followed his gaze, his smile fading. "What's that?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Brandon said quickly, slipping the envelope into his pocket. "I'll take care of it." The truth was, he didn't know how he was going to take care of it. Rent was due in 2 days, and they were still short by $400. No amount of odd jobs could bridge that gap in time. The thought of losing their home made his chest tighten, but he couldn't let Caleb see his fear. After dinner, ramen noodles with the last egg split between them. Brandon sat by the window, staring at the construction site across the street. The framework of the building was illuminated by floodlights, casting long shadows on the ground below. He thought about Rick's words. Survival step one. Step two is figuring out how to get ahead. But how could he think about getting ahead when survival was still a daily struggle? The next morning, Brandon arrived at the construction site before sunrise. Rick greeted him with a nod, tossing him a safety vest and a pair of gloves. "Got a special job for you today," Rick said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're pouring concrete for the foundation. You're gonna help me mix it." Brandon's eyes widened. "You trust me with that? Don't screw it up, and we'll be fine," Rick said with a wink. They spent the morning preparing the concrete, measuring and mixing the materials with precision. Rick explained each step in detail, showing Brandon how to check the consistency and ensure the mix was strong enough to hold the weight of the building. "This is the most important part of the whole project," Rick said as they worked. "A building's only as strong as its foundation. Get this wrong, and the whole thing could come crashing down." Brandon nodded, the metaphor not lost on him. His own life felt like it was built on shaky ground, every decision a precarious attempt to keep everything from collapsing. But as he worked alongside Rick, he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that he was building something solid, not just for the construction site, but for himself and Caleb. By the end of the day, Brandon was covered in sweat and dust, but he felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The foundation was poured, smooth and level, a tangible symbol of progress. Rick clapped him on the back as they packed up for the day. "Good work, kid," Rick said. "You've got potential. Stick with this, and you might just have a future here." That evening, as Brandon walked home, he noticed a group of men standing near the entrance to the apartment complex. One of them was their landlord, Mr. Hayes, a burly man with a perpetually sour expression. The others were strangers, dressed in suits and holding clipboards. Brandon's stomach churned. He quickened his pace, hoping to avoid them, but Mr. Hayes spotted him. "Hey, kid," the landlord called out. "Got a minute?" Brandon froze, his heart pounding. He forced himself to approach, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I need that rent by Friday," Mr. Hayes said, his tone cold. "No excuses." "I know," Brandon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm working on it." Mr. Hayes narrowed his eyes. "You better be. Because if I don't have it by then, you and your brother are out." The words hit Brandon like a punch to the gut, but he nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'll get it." As he climbed the stairs to their apartment, Brandon's mind raced. He had less than 48 hours to come up with $400, and the odds were stacked against him. But as he looked at Caleb's sleeping form, he knew he couldn't give up. He would do whatever it took to keep them together, even if it meant asking for help. The next morning, Brandon arrived at the construction site with a plan. He found Rick near the supply trailer, loading tools into the back of a truck. "Rick," Brandon said, his voice steady despite the anxiety twisting in his gut. "I need a favor." Rick raised an eyebrow. "What kind of favor?" Brandon hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I need to make $400 by tomorrow. I'll do whatever it takes. Work late, take on extra shifts, anything. Just give me a chance." Rick studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "All right, kid. Let's see what you're made of." A bridge to tomorrow. Brandon was already sweating by the time the sun peeked over the horizon, its light casting long shadows over the construction site. The site buzzed with life, workers shouting instructions, machinery groaning as it moved materials, and the constant sound of hammers and drills echoing in the air. But Brandon wasn't overwhelmed. Not today. He had a single burning goal: to earn $400 by the end of the day. Rick had taken a chance on him, allowing Brandon to stay for the full day. But there was a catch. "If you want this, you're working like the rest of us," Rick had said that morning. "No shortcuts. No complaints. You'll take every shift I can throw at you." "I'll do it," Brandon had replied, his voice firm. And so it began. The morning grind. The first task was to unload a shipment of cement bags from a flat truck. Each bag weighed 80 pounds, and the men moved them with practiced ease, hauling two at a time on their shoulders like it was nothing. Brandon, however, could only manage one, his arms trembling with the effort. Still, he pushed himself, matching the pace of the others as best he could. "Don't rush," Rick advised as Brandon hefted his third bag. "This isn't a sprint. You'll burn out before noon." Brandon nodded, adjusting his grip on the bag. The rough fabric dug into his skin, but he didn't care. He couldn't afford to care. Every bag he moved felt like a step closer to saving his home, to keeping Caleb safe. By the time the truck was empty, Brandon's shirt was soaked with sweat, and his arms felt like jelly. He leaned against a stack of pallets, gulping water from a bottle Rick handed him. "You're still standing," Rick said, smirking. "That's something." Brandon managed a weak smile. "What's next?" Rick chuckled. "No rest for the wicked, huh? All right, kid. Let's see how you handle a hammer." The next task involved assembling wooden frames for a section of the foundation. Brandon worked alongside Rick and two other workers, watching closely as they demonstrated how to measure and cut the planks before nailing them into place. His first few attempts were clumsy, crooked nails and uneven cuts, but Rick corrected him patiently, showing him the right way to angle a hammer and steady the wood. "Not bad," Rick said after Brandon completed his third frame. "You're getting the hang of it." Brandon didn't respond, too focused on driving the last nail into place. The repetitive motion was oddly satisfying, each swing of the hammer releasing some of the tension that had built up in his chest over the past weeks. For the first time in a long time, He felt like he was building something tangible, something that mattered. The unexpected offer. By noon, Brandon had worked harder than he ever had in his life. His muscles screamed in protest, and his hands were blistered despite the gloves Rick had given him. But as he sat on a stack of lumber during their lunch break, eating the sandwich Rick had brought him, he felt a flicker of pride. He had earned his place here, if only for the day. As the crew returned to work, Brandon spotted a figure approaching the site. It was a man in his late 50s, wearing a crisp blue shirt and polished boots that marked him as someone important. The workers straightened as he approached, murmuring among themselves. "That's Mr. Latham," Rick whispered to Brandon. "Site supervisor. He doesn't usually come down here unless there's a problem." Brandon's stomach tightened as Mr. Latham's gaze swept over the site, finally landing on him. The supervisor's sharp eyes narrowed, and he strode toward Rick. "What's this?" Latham asked, nodding toward Brandon. Rick didn't flinch. "Kid's helping out for the day. He's got a good work ethic." Latham frowned. "You know we can't have minors on the site. Liability issues." "He's not causing any trouble," Rick said evenly. "And he's not on the payroll." "Doesn't matter," Latham snapped. "If the inspectors show up and see him here, we're all in trouble." Brandon felt his chest tighten, the weight of disappointment crushing him. He'd worked so hard, pushed himself past his limits, and now it was all slipping away. "Wait," he said, stepping forward before he could stop himself. "I know I'm not supposed to be here, but I need this. My brother and we're about to lose our apartment. I'll do anything. Please." Latham stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of machinery. Then, to Brandon's surprise, Latham sighed. "Rick," Latham said, his tone softer now, "if the kid's that desperate, maybe we can find something off-site for him. Something that doesn't break the rules." Rick nodded. "I've got a few ideas." Brandon's heart leaped. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Latham said gruffly. "You've got a lot to prove, kid. If you mess this up, you're done." Off-site hustle. Rick led Brandon to a storage yard a few blocks away, where supplies for the construction site were stored. The yard was cluttered with pallets of bricks, stacks of wood, and rusted equipment that needed sorting and cleaning. "Not glamorous," Rick said, handing Brandon a pair of work gloves and a clipboard. "But it's a job." Brandon nodded, already moving toward the nearest stack of bricks. He worked tirelessly, organizing materials, sweeping debris, and hauling heavy loads across the yard. The tasks were monotonous, but Brandon didn't mind. Every piece he moved, every inch of progress he made, felt like a step closer to saving his home. Rick checked on him periodically, offering advice and encouragement. "Keep it up, kid. You're doing good." As the afternoon stretched into evening, Brandon's body screamed for rest, but he refused to stop. He thought of Caleb's smile, of the home they shared, of everything he was fighting to protect. A glimmer of hope. By the time Brandon finished, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He stood in the storage yard, surrounded by neatly organized stacks of materials, his hands raw and his body aching. Rick approached, a look of approval on his face. "Not bad," Rick said. "Not bad at all." Brandon wiped the sweat from his brow, too tired to respond. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Latham approved some overtime for the crew today, and I made sure a little of it found its way to you." Brandon's eyes widened as he opened the envelope. Inside were crisp bills totaling $200. "It's not everything you need," Rick said, "but it's a start." Brandon's voice caught in his throat. I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Rick said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Just keep showing up. You've got potential, kid. Don't waste it." That night, Brandon returned home to find Caleb waiting for him, his face lighting up when he saw the envelope in Brandon's hand. "Did you get enough?" Caleb asked. Not yet, Brandon admitted, sitting beside him. But I will. For the first time in months, Brandon felt something he hadn't dared to feel. Hope. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something. One brick, one beam, one step at a time. A spark of change. The morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains of Brandon and Caleb's tiny apartment, illuminating the room with a soft glow. It was a new day, but the weight of their challenges remained. The $200 in Brandon's pocket from Rick's unexpected help was a start, but it wasn't enough. They still needed another $200 by the end of the day to avoid eviction. Caleb was awake early, scribbling in his notebook at the table, his messy blonde hair falling into his eyes. He looked up as Brandon emerged from their shared mattress, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Morning, Caleb said, grinning. Did you sleep? Brandon nodded, even though the bags under his eyes told a different story. Yeah, squirt. What about you? Yep. I even finished my math homework, Caleb said proudly, holding up the notebook. See? Brandon smiled, ruffling Caleb's hair. You're gonna be the smartest kid in class. Huh. Just like Mom wanted, Caleb replied, his voice soft. The mention of their mother hit Brandon like a punch to the gut, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to break, not when so much depended on him. Get ready for school, he said. I'll make breakfast. An unexpected visitor. As Caleb ate his breakfast, toast with peanut butter, their go-to meal, there was a knock at the door. Brandon tensed, half expecting it to be their landlord coming to deliver another warning. He opened the door cautiously, but to his surprise, it wasn't Mr. Hayes. It was Rick. Rick, Brandon said, his eyes widening. What are you doing here? Rick stepped inside, looking slightly out of place in their cramped apartment. He held a clipboard in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Figured I'd give you a ride to the site, he said gruffly. But first, I need you to hear me out. Brandon frowned. What's going on? Rick sighed, scratching the back of his neck. After you left yesterday, I got to thinking. You're a hard worker, and you're not afraid to learn. Guys like you, they don't come around often. So, I made some calls. Calls? Brandon echoed, confused. To a buddy of mine who runs a youth apprenticeship program, Rick explained. It's for kids like you, kids who need a break. It's legit, pays minimum wage, and comes with on-the-job training. You'd get steady hours and a foot in the door for real construction work. Brandon blinked, the weight of Rick's words sinking in slowly. You mean, I get an actual job? Rick nodded. Yeah, it's not much, but it's a start. And if you stick with it, you could turn it into a career. For a moment, Brandon was too stunned to speak. He had spent so long fighting just to survive that the idea of something stable, something real, felt almost too good to be true. Why would you do this for me? He asked finally. Rick shrugged. Because someone did it for me once. Besides, you remind me of my son. Brandon's throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Rick said, holding up a hand. You've got one day to prove you can handle this. Show me what you're made of, and I'll get you into the program. Deal. Brandon swallowed hard and nodded. Deal. The hardest day yet. The construction site was already bustling when Brandon and Rick arrived. Brandon wasted no time, throwing himself into the work with renewed determination. The tasks were grueling. Unloading more materials, hauling equipment across the site, and assisting with a concrete pour for the building's foundation. The sun climbed higher, its heat beating down on Brandon as he worked. His muscles burned, and his hands, already raw from the previous days, stung with each movement. But he didn't complain. He couldn't. This was his chance, and he wouldn't waste it. By midday, Brandon was exhausted, but Rick pushed him to keep going. You wanted this, kid, Rick said, handing him a bottle of water. Now show me you can handle it. Brandon nodded, downing the water in one go before getting back to work. He joined a team of workers assembling scaffolding, following their instructions carefully. It was slow, meticulous work, requiring both strength and precision, but Brandon stayed focused, determined not to make any mistakes. "Not bad," one of the workers said as Brandon secured a metal brace. "You've got a steady hand." "Thanks," Brandon said, wiping the sweat from his brow. The compliment bolstered his confidence, giving him the energy to push through the rest of the afternoon. A life-changing moment. As the day wound to a close, Rick called Brandon over. They stood at the edge of the site, the building's skeletal framework casting long shadows in the golden light of the setting sun. "You did good today, kid," Rick said, his tone approving. "Real good. Does that mean?" Brandon began, his heart pounding. Rick smirked. "Yeah, it means you're in. I'll call my buddy tonight and get you started on Monday." Brandon felt a surge of relief and gratitude, but before he could thank Rick, the older man held up a hand. "One more thing," Rick said. "This came out of today's work." He handed Brandon an envelope. Brandon opened it, his breath catching when he saw the bills inside. Another $200. It was exactly what he needed to cover the rent. "I can't believe this," Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Rick shrugged. "You earned it. Now go take care of your brother. A new beginning." That evening, Brandon returned home with a bag of groceries and the $400 he needed for rent. Caleb's eyes lit up when he saw the food, and even more when Brandon handed him a candy bar, a rare treat. "Did you really get all this from working today?" Caleb asked, his voice full of wonder. Brandon nodded. "And there's more good news. I got into an apprenticeship program. It's a real job. Squirt. We're gonna be okay." Caleb threw his arms around Brandon, hugging him tightly. "I knew you could do it." For the first time in what felt like forever, Brandon allowed himself to believe it too. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building a future. The next few days brought a whirlwind of changes. Brandon paid the rent on time, easing the landlord's suspicions. Caleb's cough finally cleared up, and his grades continued to improve. And on Monday morning, Brandon arrived at the construction site as an official apprentice, ready to start the next chapter of his life. The work was still hard, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but Brandon knew one thing for sure: they had turned a corner. With every brick he laid, every beam he secured, he was building something stronger, not just for the building, but for himself and Caleb. The next morning, Brandon woke before his alarm, his body aching from the previous day's work. The dim light of dawn filtered into the apartment, highlighting the small stack of bills on the table. $200 down, $200 to go. The deadline loomed, but there was hope now, a flicker of light that had been missing for so long. Caleb was still asleep, curled up under the patched blanket they shared. Brandon took a moment to smooth the boy's hair, feeling a pang of guilt for leaving him alone so often. "Just a little longer, Squirt," he whispered. "We're almost there." Back to the site. Rick's truck rumbled to a stop outside the apartment complex at 6:30 a.m. sharp. Brandon hopped in, clutching his fraying backpack, which held little more than a bottle of water and a hastily packed sandwich. "You ready for another day?" Rick asked, sipping from his coffee thermos. "Yes, sir," Brandon replied, his tone resolute. "Good," Rick said, "because today's going to be tougher than yesterday." When they arrived at the construction site, it was already bustling with activity. The foreman, Mr. Latham, was there again, clipboard in hand, his sharp eyes scanning the workers like a hawk. "Stick close to me today," Rick advised. "We're pouring the concrete slabs for the first floor. It's messy, exhausting work, but it's also one of the most important steps." Brandon nodded, trying to push aside his nerves. He had seen the workers pour concrete before, but he hadn't realized how much effort went into preparing the mix, spreading it evenly, and ensuring it set properly. Today, he would be part of that process. The concrete pour, The truck arrived mid-morning, its massive drum churning the concrete mix. Rick handed Brandon a long metal rake and showed him how to spread the mixture evenly as it poured into the wooden forms. "Work fast, but don't rush," Rick said. "You've got to keep it smooth. Any bubbles or gaps, and the whole thing could crack under pressure." Brandon nodded, gripping the rake tightly. As the concrete poured, he moved with urgency, spreading the thick, gray mixture across the forms. It was backbreaking work, the weight of the rake and the resistance of the concrete testing his strength. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool morning air, but he didn't stop. "Looking good, kid," Rick said, glancing over. "Keep it steady." Brandon focused, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed through the pain. He thought of Caleb, of their apartment, of the landlord's threats. Every motion of the rake felt like a step toward something better. By the time the slab was poured and smoothed, Brandon's arms felt like they might fall off. He leaned against the edge of the form, gulping down water from a bottle Rick handed him. "You're still standing," Rick said with a grin. "That's a good sign." "Barely," Brandon admitted, his voice hoarse. "You'll get used to it," Rick said. "The first week's always the hardest." An unwanted encounter. As the crew moved on to the next section, Brandon noticed Mr. Latham approaching. The site supervisor's expression was unreadable, his clipboard tucked under one arm. "Rick," Latham said, his tone sharp. "Got a minute?" Rick nodded, motioning for Brandon to keep working. Brandon tried to focus on his task, but he couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. "What's he doing here?" Latham asked, his voice low but firm. "He's helping," Rick replied evenly. "You know we can't have him on site," Latham said. "If Asha shows up." "They won't," Rick interrupted. "And even if they did, he's not breaking any rules. He's just here to learn." Latham sighed, rubbing his temple. "You're putting your neck on the line for this kid. He better be worth it." "He is," Rick said without hesitation. Brandon's chest tightened as he heard Rick's words. He knew the older man was taking a risk by letting him stay, and he silently vowed not to let him down. The test. After lunch, Rick pulled Brandon aside. "Got a special job for you," he said, handing Brandon a clipboard with a list of measurements and instructions. "You're going to prep the forms for the next slab. Think you can handle it?" Brandon studied the clipboard, his brow furrowing. The instructions were detailed, full of numbers and angles that made his head spin. "I'll do my best," he said, his voice steady. Rick clapped him on the shoulder. "That's all I ask." Brandon set to work, measuring and cutting the wooden planks that would form the boundaries for the next concrete pour. It was slow, meticulous work, requiring both precision and patience. He double-checked every measurement, his hands trembling slightly as he nailed the pieces together. By the time he finished, the sun was dipping lower in the sky. Rick inspected his work, nodding in approval. "Not bad, kid. Not bad at all." Brandon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thanks. Go grab some water," Rick said. "You've earned it." The payoff. As the day wound down, Rick handed Brandon another envelope. Brandon hesitated before opening it, his hands shaking. Inside were crisp bills, exactly $200. "You've got a solid start here," Rick said. "And if you keep working like this, there's more where that came from." Brandon stared at the money, his throat tight. "I don't know how to thank you." Rick shrugged. "Don't thank me. Just show up tomorrow and keep proving me right." Home, for now. When Brandon got home that evening, Caleb was waiting at the table, his face lighting up when Brandon showed him the money. "Does this mean we can stay?" Caleb asked, his voice hopeful. Brandon nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, squirt. We can stay." For the first time in weeks, Brandon felt like the ground beneath his feet was solid. The rent was paid, and for now, they were safe. But more than that, he had a job, a real opportunity to build something lasting. As he tucked Caleb into bed that night, he whispered, We're gonna be okay. I promise. Building beyond survival. Monday morning arrived with a nervous excitement Brandon hadn't felt in years. As he dressed in his second-hand jeans and the cleanest shirt he could find, he caught sight of Caleb at the kitchen table, finishing his breakfast. "You look different," Caleb said, squinting at him. "Like, official." Brandon chuckled, adjusting the strap of the backpack that now carried his lunch and a new notebook. "Yeah, squirt. Guess I am." "Are you nervous?" Caleb asked. "A little," Brandon admitted, "but it's the good kind of nervous." "You're gonna crush it," Caleb said with the absolute confidence only a little brother could have. "You always do." Brandon ruffled Caleb's hair. "Don't forget your homework. And no skipping lunch today. Got it?" "Got it," Caleb replied, grinning. As Brandon stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, carrying with it a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Today wasn't just another day of survival. It was the first step toward something more. The first day. The apprenticeship program wasn't held directly at the construction site, but in a training facility a few blocks away. Rick had given Brandon directions, and as Brandon approached the large warehouse-like building, he noticed a handful of other teenagers standing near the entrance, looking just as nervous as he felt. A middle-aged man in a safety vest and glasses greeted the group, introducing himself as Mr. Clark, the program coordinator. "Welcome to your first day in the Youth Construction Apprenticeship Program," he began, his voice firm but encouraging. "This program isn't just about learning to hammer nails or pour concrete. It's about discipline, responsibility, and building a foundation for your future." Brandon listened intently, the weight of those words settling over him. A foundation for your future. He liked the sound of that. The first half of the day was spent in a classroom, learning the basics of construction safety, blueprint reading, and tool identification. Brandon scribbled notes furiously, determined to absorb everything. He couldn't afford to fall behind, not when so much depended on this opportunity. At lunchtime, he sat with a few of the other apprentices, introducing himself and sharing bits of his story. Most of the others were in similar situations, kids from tough backgrounds trying to find a way out. "Man, I didn't think this would be so serious," one of the boys said, poking at his sandwich. "I thought we'd just be, like, hammering stuff." "It's serious because it matters," Brandon replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "This isn't just a job. It's a chance to change things." The others nodded, some looking thoughtful, others skeptical, but Brandon didn't care. He wasn't here to convince anyone else. He was here for Caleb and himself. Hands-on training. The afternoon was spent in the workshop, where the apprentices got their first taste of hands-on construction. Brandon's group was tasked with building a small wooden frame, following the measurements and instructions provided by Mr. Clark. It was more challenging than Brandon expected. The wood had to be cut precisely, the nails driven in at just the right angle, and the whole structure had to be sturdy. "You've got a good eye," Mr. Clark said as he inspected Brandon's work. "Keep that up, and you'll go far." Brandon couldn't help but smile. Praise like that was rare in his life, and it fueled his determination to do even better. A glimpse of progress. After the first day of training, Brandon returned to the construction site to see Rick. The older man was overseeing a crew assembling scaffolding, but he paused when he spotted Brandon. "Well, how'd it go?" Rick asked, leaning on a beam. "It was amazing," Brandon said, his voice filled with genuine excitement. "I learned so much already, and they said I have a good eye for detail." Rick smirked. "Told you you'd fit right in. Keep at it, kid. This is just the beginning." Challenges at home. That evening, Brandon returned home to find Caleb sitting at the table, his math homework spread out in front of him. The boy looked up as Brandon entered, his face lighting up. "How was it?" Caleb asked. "It was good," Brandon said, dropping his backpack onto the floor. "A lot of hard work, but I'm getting the hang of it." "Did you get paid yet?" Caleb asked innocently. Brandon hesitated. Not yet. The first check won't come for a couple of weeks. Caleb nodded, but Brandon could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. They had managed to scrape by for now, but the pressure of the next round of bills was already looming. Brandon made a silent promise to figure it out, just like he always did. The second week. As the days turned into weeks, Brandon began to settle into the routine of the apprenticeship. Each morning, he woke before dawn to prepare Caleb for school and make sure their apartment was in order. Then he would head to the training facility, where he continued to learn and grow. The program was intense, pushing him physically and mentally, but Brandon thrived under the structure. He discovered a knack for precision work, excelling in tasks like measuring, cutting, and assembling. Mr. Clark often used Brandon's work as an example for the other apprentices, praising his attention to detail and willingness to learn. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The long hours and physical demands took a toll on Brandon's body, and there were days when he questioned whether he could keep going. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table icing his sore hands, Caleb approached him with a concerned look. "You okay?" Caleb asked. Brandon forced a smile. "Just tired. Nothing I can't handle." Caleb hesitated, then said, "You don't have to do this alone, you know. I can help." "You're helping just by being you, Squirt," Brandon said, ruffling his brother's hair. "Don't worry about me. I've got this." A life-changing opportunity. By the end of the second week, Brandon's dedication and hard work hadn't gone unnoticed. Mr. Clark pulled him aside after class one day, his expression serious. "Brandon, I've been watching you," Mr. Clark said. "You've got something special, a drive and focus that most people your age don't have." "Thank you, sir," Brandon said, his heart pounding. "I'm just trying to make the most of this." "Well, it shows," Mr. Clark said. "And I think you're ready for the next step." Brandon frowned. "The next step?" "There's a scholarship program for apprentices who excel," Mr. Clark explained. "It covers tuition for trade school and guarantees placement in a paid internship after graduation. It's competitive, but I think you've got a real shot." Brandon's breath caught. "A scholarship?" Mr. Clark nodded. "It's not just about the money. It's about giving you a path forward, a chance to build a future for yourself and your brother." Brandon couldn't believe what he was hearing. For so long, his life had been about surviving from one day to the next. Now, for the first time, he could see the outline of something bigger, something lasting. "I'll do whatever it takes," Brandon said, his voice firm. Mr. Clark smiled. "That's what I like to hear. Let's get started." That night, Brandon sat by the window of their apartment, staring out at the city lights. Caleb was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and steady. In his hands, Brandon held the application for the scholarship, his mind racing with possibilities. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building. One step at a time, one brick at a time, they were creating something stronger than the struggles they'd faced. For the first time in a long time, Brandon felt like he was standing on solid ground. Laying the groundwork. Brandon sat at the kitchen table that evening, his mind racing as he filled out the scholarship application Mr. Clark had handed him. The words blurred in front of his tired eyes, but he pressed on, carefully answering each question. This was more than just a piece of paper. It was a lifeline, a chance to break free from the cycle of survival that had defined his life for the past year. "What you doing?" Caleb's voice broke the silence. He padded into the kitchen, dragging his blanket behind him like a cape. "Just some paperwork for the apprenticeship," Brandon said, forcing a smile. "Shouldn't you be in bed?" Caleb shrugged, leaning against the table. "I couldn't sleep." "Is it hard?" Brandon looked down at the application, then at Caleb. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. This could help us a lot." Caleb studied his brother's face for a moment, then said, "I think you can do it. You're the smartest person I know." Brandon chuckled softly. "Thanks, Squirt. Now go back to bed, okay? Tomorrow's a school day." Caleb nodded, yawning as he shuffled back to the bedroom. Brandon watched him go, his determination hardening. He couldn't let Caleb down. Proving himself. The next day at the apprenticeship program, Brandon threw himself into his work with even greater intensity. The tasks were more challenging now as the apprentices began learning advanced techniques, from framing walls to installing electrical conduits. Brandon's hands were blistered, and his arms ached, but he refused to slow down. "Take your time," Mr. Clark advised as Brandon measured and cut a piece of drywall. "Precision matters more than speed." "Yes, sir," Brandon replied, adjusting his grip on the tape measure. He double-checked his calculations before making the cut, ensuring everything was exact. By lunchtime, Brandon had completed his assigned tasks ahead of schedule. Mr. Clark approached him as he sat eating his sandwich, nodding in approval. "You're consistent, Brandon," Mr. Clark said. "That's a rare quality." "Thanks," Brandon said, swallowing a bite of food. "I'm just trying to do my best." "You're doing more than that," Mr. Clark said. "And it's not going unnoticed." The words filled Brandon with a quiet sense of pride. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. The first big test. Toward the end of the week, Mr. Clark announced a group project. The apprentices would work in teams to build a small, fully functional storage shed. Each team would be responsible for every aspect of the construction, from laying the foundation to installing the roof. Brandon was paired with two other apprentices, Marcus and Alina. Marcus was brash and confident, often taking the lead without consulting anyone, while Alina was meticulous but hesitant, double and triple-checking every step. "All right," Brandon said as they stood around the pile of materials they'd been assigned. "Let's figure out who's doing what." "I'll handle the framing," Marcus said immediately. "I've done it before." "Okay," Brandon said, nodding. "Alina, you good with measuring and cutting the wood?" "I think so," Alina said hesitantly. "But we should double-check the measurements before cutting." "That's fine," Brandon said. "I'll work on the foundation and help wherever else I'm needed." They got to work, but tensions quickly rose. Marcus rushed through his framing, which led to mistakes that Alina caught too late. Meanwhile, Brandon struggled to keep the foundation level, fighting against the uneven ground they'd been assigned. "Marcus, slow down," Brandon said, his frustration bubbling over. "If the framing's off, the whole thing's going to collapse." "I know what I'm doing," Marcus snapped. "Why don't you worry about your part?" "Guys," Alina said, her voice small, "we're running out of time. Can we just focus?" Brandon took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You're right, Alina. Let's focus. Marcus, can you double-check your angles? I'll help level the base." Marcus muttered under his breath, but eventually relented, and the team got back on track. By the end of the day, their shed was complete. It wasn't perfect. One of the walls leaned slightly, and the roof shingles weren't as even as Brandon would have liked, but it was sturdy and functional. Mr. Clark inspected their work, nodding thoughtfully. "Not bad," he said. "A little rough around the edges, but you worked through the challenges. That's what matters." Brandon felt a wave of relief. The project had tested his patience and leadership skills, but it had also taught him the value of teamwork and communication. The visit. That weekend, Brandon received an unexpected call from Mr. Clark. "I'm coming by your place tomorrow," Mr. Clark said. "I need to drop off some paperwork and check on how things are going." Brandon's stomach twisted. Their apartment was clean but small, and he worried about what Mr. Clark might think. Still, he knew he couldn't refuse. The next day, Mr. Clark arrived in his truck, carrying a folder of documents. Caleb was at the table, working on a puzzle, while Brandon greeted Mr. Clark at the door. "Thanks for coming," Brandon said, his voice tight with nervousness. Mr. Clark stepped inside, glancing around the modest apartment. His gaze lingered on the patched walls and the second-hand furniture, but he didn't comment. "This is my brother, Caleb," Brandon said, gesturing toward the table. "Caleb, this is Mr. Clark. He runs the apprenticeship program." "Hi," Caleb said, offering a shy wave. "Nice to meet you, Caleb," Mr. Clark said, smiling warmly. "Your brother talks about you a lot." Caleb beamed, and Brandon felt a pang of gratitude for Mr. Clark's kindness. As Mr. Clark handed Brandon the folder, he said, "This is the scholarship application you've been working on. I added a recommendation letter for you. Thought it might help." Brandon's eyes widened. "You wrote me a letter?" Mr. Clark nodded. "You've earned it. Keep working hard, and you'll go far." A glimmer of hope. That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, Brandon sat by the window, reading through the recommendation letter. Mr. Clark's words were filled with praise for his dedication, perseverance, and natural leadership skills. It was the kind of validation Brandon had rarely received, and it made his chest tighten with emotion. He glanced at the stack of bills on the table. The rent was covered for another month, but he knew their challenges weren't over. Still, for the first time, Brandon felt like they were building something real, something lasting. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. Then he looked out at the city lights, the faint outline of the construction site visible in the distance. The work wasn't done, but the foundation was there. Now it was time to build. The walls start to rise. The morning sun peeked through the cracks in Brandon's bedroom curtains, bathing the small apartment in a warm golden glow. Another day of hard work awaited, but today felt different. With Mr. Clark's recommendation letter tucked safely in his backpack and the scholarship application nearing completion, Brandon felt the weight of both excitement and pressure. Caleb sat at the table, humming to himself as he drew a superhero in his notebook, a character with broad shoulders and a glowing hammer. Brandon chuckled as he walked over. "Who's that supposed to be?" he asked, tussling Caleb's hair. "It's you," Caleb replied, grinning. "You're like a superhero now." "Me?" Brandon laughed, though his chest swelled with pride. "I don't have any powers, squirt." "You don't need powers," Caleb said matter-of-factly. "You just need to keep being you." Brandon felt a lump rise in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it down. "All right, artist. Finish that masterpiece while I get ready for work." The apprenticeship heats up. At the training facility, the apprentices were diving into more advanced construction techniques. Mr. Clark explained that this week's focus would be on electrical systems, a crucial but often overlooked aspect of building. "You can build the strongest walls and pour the sturdiest foundation," Mr. Clark said, pacing in front of the group. "But if the wiring isn't right, the whole building is at risk." Brandon nodded, scribbling notes as fast as his hand could move. The technical details were overwhelming. Wiring diagrams, voltage calculations, circuit breakers. But he relished the challenge. Each new skill felt like another brick in the structure of his future. When it came time for hands-on practice, the apprentices worked in pairs to wire a mock wall with outlets and light switches. Brandon was paired with Elena again, and together they studied the diagram, carefully laying out the wiring. "Do you think we're doing this right?" Elena asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Brandon double-checked their work, tracing the wires with his finger. "I think so. Let's test it." They connected the power supply and held their breath as Mr. Clark flipped the switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting a warm glow over their work. "Great job," Mr. Clark said, nodding approvingly. "Keep up this level of attention to detail, and you'll go far." Brandon smiled, feeling a surge of confidence. For the first time, he could picture himself thriving in this field, not just surviving, but succeeding. The scholarship challenge. Later that week, Mr. Clark gathered the apprentices for an announcement. "As you all know, the scholarship deadline is approaching," he said. "To help decide who gets it, we'll be holding a competition. Each of you will design and build a project, a piece that showcases your skills, creativity, and understanding of construction principles." The room buzzed with excitement and nervous whispers. Brandon's mind raced. This was his chance to prove himself, but the stakes were higher than ever. The scholarship wasn't just a prize, it was a lifeline for him and Caleb. The projects are due in 3 weeks, Mr. Clark continued. You'll have access to the workshop and materials during training hours, but you're expected to do the work yourselves. No shortcuts, no excuses. Brandon's heart pounded as he started sketching ideas in his notebook. He wanted his project to stand out, to reflect not just his skills, but also his journey. A project with heart. Over the next few days, Brandon spent every spare moment brainstorming his project. He wanted to create something meaningful, something that told his story. Finally, inspiration struck. A scaled-down version of a house, complete with walls, a roof, wiring, and plumbing. It's symbolic, Brandon explained to Mr. Clark during a one-on-one discussion. A house is more than just a structure. It's a foundation, a shelter, a place to grow. Mr. Clark nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. Ambitious, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you. Brandon threw himself into the work with everything he had. During training hours, he measured and cut wood, assembling the frame with painstaking precision. He stayed late most days, working on the wiring and plumbing systems, ensuring every detail was perfect. Elena and Marcus occasionally stopped by to check on his progress. While Marcus teased him about being a perfectionist, Elena offered quiet encouragement. "You're really good at this," she said one evening as Brandon sanded down a rough edge on one of the walls. "I mean it. You've got a gift." "Thanks," Brandon replied, his voice soft. "I'm just trying to make it count." Balancing acts. At home, things remained challenging. While the apprenticeship provided some income, it wasn't enough to cover everything. Brandon continued taking odd jobs on weekends, mowing lawns, running errands, and doing anything else he could to make ends meet. Caleb noticed the strain and tried to help in small ways, tidying up the apartment, doing his homework without being asked, and even offering to sell his favorite action figures. "You don't have to do that," Brandon said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll figure it out." "But I want to help," Caleb insisted. "You already do," Brandon said, pulling his brother into a hug. "More than you know." The competition day. 3 weeks flew by, and before Brandon knew it, the competition day had arrived. The workshop buzzed with energy as the apprentices unveiled their projects. There were shelves, chairs, intricate models, and even a small bridge. Brandon stood nervously beside his house model, wiping his hands on his jeans as Mr. Clark and a panel of judges made their rounds. When they reached his project, Brandon took a deep breath and began his presentation. "This isn't just a house," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "It's a symbol of what construction means to me. A house is more than walls and a roof. It's a place where people feel safe, where families grow, where lives are built. That's what I want to do. I want to build things that matter." The judges examined his work closely, testing the stability of the frame, inspecting the wiring, and running water through the miniature plumbing system. Each time, Brandon's heart raced, but everything functioned perfectly. "Well done," one of the judges said, nodding. "You clearly put a lot of thought and effort into this." "Thank you," Brandon replied, his chest swelling with pride. The results. That evening, as the apprentices gathered in the workshop, Mr. Clark stepped forward to announce the winner. Brandon's heart pounded as he clutched Caleb's superhero drawing in his pocket, a silent reminder of why he was doing this. "The winner of this year's apprenticeship scholarship," Mr. Clark began, pausing for dramatic effect, "is Brandon Miller." For a moment, Brandon couldn't process the words. Then the room erupted in applause, and Elena gave him a thumbs up from across the room. "You earned it," Mr. Clark said, shaking his hand. "This is just the beginning for you. A new chapter." That night, Brandon returned home to find Caleb waiting at the table, a celebratory bowl of cereal in front of him. "Well?" Caleb asked eagerly. Brandon pulled the scholarship certificate from his backpack, setting it on the table with a grin. "We did it, squirt." Caleb jumped up, throwing his arms around Brandon. "I knew you would." As they sat together, Laughing and talking about the future, Brandon felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. The scholarship was more than a financial boost. It was a ticket to a better life. Through the window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and the construction site loomed in the distance. It was a reminder of how far they'd come and how much farther they could go. Brick by brick, beam by beam, they were building something stronger than the past. Something that would last.